The Indians informed them that their fresh corpse was placed in damp ground, that the flesh might be consumed by degrees. Some months afterwards it was taken out, and the flesh remaining on the bones was scraped off with sharp stones. Earthen vases were half-baked were found near the baskets. They appeared to contain the bones of the family. The largest of these three vases, or funeral urns, were 5 feet high and the 3 feet 3 inches long. Their color was the greenish gray, and their oval form was pleasing to the eye. The handles were made in the shape of crocodiles or serpents. The edges were bordered with painted meanders, labyrinths, and gricks in rows variously and combined. Such designs are found in every zone among the nations, the furthest removed from any other, either with respect to their respective positions on the globe, or to the degree of civilization which they had attained. They still adorn the common pottery which made by the inhabitants of the little mission of Maypures. The ornaments of the bucklers of the Otathayans and the fishing implements of the Esquimaux, the walls of the Mexican palace of Mitila, and the vases of ancient Greek. They could not acquire any precise idea to the period to which the origin of the baskets and the painted vases contained in the bone caravan of Atarupe could be traced. A tradition circulated among the Guahibos that the warlike Atures, pursued by the Caribs, escaped to the rocks that rose in the middle of the great cataracts, and there that nation became gradually extinct, as well as its language. The last families of the Atures still existed in 1767, in the time of the missionary Gilly. At the period of Humboldt's voyage, an old parrot was shown at Maypures, of which the inhabitants said that they did not understand what it said because it spoke the language of Atures. The travelers opened to the great concern of their guides several baskets for the purpose of examining attentively the form of the skulls. They were all marked by characteristics of the American race, with the exception of 2 or 3 which approached to the Caucasian. In the middle of the cataracts, in the most inaccessible spots, cases were found strengthened with iron bands and filled with European tools, vestiges of clothes, and glass trinkets. These articles, which had given rise to the most absurd reports of treasure hidden by the Jesuits, probably belonged to the Portuguese traders who had penetrated into these savage countries. Humboldt and Bonpland took several skulls, the skeleton of a child of 6 or 7 years old, and 2 fully grown men of the nation of Atures from the caravan of Atarupe. All these bones, partly painted red, partly varnished with odoriferous resins, were placed in the baskets which we have just described. They made almost the whole load of a mule. And as the travelers knew the superstitious feelings of the Indians in reference to the remains of the dead after burial, they carefully enveloped the baskets in mats recently woven. Unfortunately for them, the penetration of the Indians and to the extreme quickness of their sense of smelling rendered all these precautions useless. Wherever they stopped in the missions of the Caribs amid the Llanos and Angostura and Nueva Barcelona, the natives assembled round their mules to admire the monkeys which had purchased at Orinoco. These good people had scarcely touched their baggage when they announced the approaching death of the beast of burden that carried the dead. In vain the travelers told them they were deceived in their conjectures, that the baskets contained the bones of crocodiles and manatees. They persisted in repeating that they smelt the resin that surrounded the skeletons, and that they were the old relations. The travelers were obliged to request that the monks would interpose their authority. The monks would interpose their authority to overcome the aversion of the natives and procure for them a change of the mules. They withdrew in silence from the caravan of Atarupe. It was one of those calm and serene nights which are so common in the torrid zone. The stars shone with mild and planetary light. Their scintillation was scarcely sensible at the horizon, which seemed illumined by the great nebulae of the southern hemisphere. An innumerable multitude of insects spread a reddish light upon the ground, loaded with plants and resplendent with these living and moving fires, as if the stars of the firmament had sunk down on the savannah. On quitting the cavern, the travelers stopped to admire the beauty of the singular scene. The odoriferous vanilla and festoons of bignonia decorated the entrance, and above, on the summit of the hill, the arrowy branches of the palm trees waved murmuring in the air. They descended towards the river to take the road to the mission, where they arrived in the night. They stayed at the mission of Atures only during the time necessary for the passing of the canoe through the great cataract. The bottom of their frail bark had become so thin that it required great care to prevent it from splitting. They took the leave of the missionary Bernardo Hosea, who remained at Atures after having accompanied them during 2 months and shared all their sufferings. This poor monk still continued to have fits of Teretian ague, who they had become to him an habitual evil to which he had paid little attention. Other fevers of a more fatal kind prevailed at Atures on their second visit. The greater part of the Indians could not leave their hammocks, and the travelers were obliged to send in search of cassava bread, the most indispensable food of the country, to the independent but neighboring tribe of the Panaras. The travelers passed in the canoe through the later half of the cataract of Atures. They landed here and there to climb upon the rocks, which like narrow dikes joined the islands one to another. Although the waters forced their way around the dikes, sometimes they fell within them with a hollow noise. A considerable portion of the Orinoco was dry because the river had found an issue by subterranean caverns. In these solitary haunts, the rock manakin with gilded plumage, one of the most beautiful birds of the tropics, built its nest. The little cataract of Karuki, Karakai, was caused by an accumulation of enormous blocks of granite, several of which were spheroids of 5 or 6 feet in diameter, and they were piled together in such a manner as to form spacious caverns. The travelers entered one of these caravans to gather the coniferae that were spread over the clefts and the humid sides of the rock. This spot displayed one of the most extraordinary scenes of nature that they had ever contemplated on the banks of the Orinoco. The river rolled its waters turbulently over the heads. It seemed like the sea dashing against the reefs of rocks. But at the entrance of the cavern, they could remain dry beneath a large sheet of water that precipitated itself in an arch above the barrier. In other cavities, deeper but less spacious, the rock was pierced by the effect of successive filtrations. They saw columns of water 8 or 9 inches abroad descending from the tops of the vault, and finding an issue by clefts that seemed to communicate at a great distance with each other. They had the opportunity of examining the extraordinary sight longer than they wished. Their boats was to coast the eastern bank of a narrow island, and to take them in again after a long circuit. They passed an hour and a half in vain expectation of it. Night approached and with it a tremendous storm. It rained with violence. They began to fear that their frail bark had been wrecked against the rocks, and that the Indians, conformably to their habitual indifference for the evils of others, had returned tranquilly to the mission. There were only 3 of the party. They were completely wet and uneasy respecting the fate of their boat. It appeared far from agreeable to pass without sleep a long night of the torrid zone, amid the noise of the cataracts. Bonpland proposed to leave Humboldt on the island, and to swim across the branches of the river that were separated by granitic dikes. He hoped to reach the forest and seek assistance at Torres from Father Zia. They dissuaded him with difficulty from undertaking this hazardous enterprise. The little monkeys, which they had carried along with them for months, were deposited on the point of the island, wet by the rains and sensible of the least lowering of the temperature. These delicate animals sent forth plaintive cries and attracted to the spot 2 crocodiles. The size and laden color which denoted their great age. After long waiting, the Indians at length arrived at the close of the day. The natural cofferdam by which they had endeavored to descend in order to make the circuit of the island had become impassable owing to the shallowness of the water. Their pilot sought long for a more accessible passage in the labyrinth of rocks and islands. Happily, the canoe was not damaged, and in less than a half hour, the instruments, provisions, and animals were embarked. They stopped a few days after at the mission of Urana. The situation of the village was extremely picturesque. The little Indian village stood at the foot of a lofty granite mountain. Rocks everywhere appeared in the form of pillars above the forest, rising higher than the tops of the tallest trees. The aspect of the Orinoco was nowhere more majestic than when viewed from the hut of the missionary, Fray Ramon Bueno. It was more than 15,600 feet broad, and it ran without any widening, like a vast canal, straight toward the east. 2 long and narrow islands contributed to the give extent to the bed of the river. The mission was inhabited by the Ottomacs, a tribe in the rudest state and presenting one of the most extraordinary physiological phenomena. They ate earth. That is to say, every day, during several months, very considerable quantities to appease hunger, and this practice did not appear to have any injurious effect on their health. Though the travelers could stay only one day at Urana, This short space of time sufficed to make them acquainted with the preparation of the balls of earth. Humboldt also found some traces of this vitiated appetite among the Guamos, and perhaps between the confluence of the Meta and the Apure, where everybody spoke of the dirt eating as of a thing anciently known. The inhabitants of Irana belonged to those nations of the savannas called the Wandering Indians, who, more difficult to civilize than the nations of the forest, had a decided aversion to cultivating the land, and lived almost exclusively by hunting and fishing. They are men of very robust constitution, but ill-looking, savage, vindictive, and passionately fond of the fermented liquors. They were omnivorous animals in the highest degree, and therefore the other Indians who considered them as barbarians had a common saying: "Nothing is so loathsome but that an Ottomac will eat it." While the waters of the Orinoco and its tributary streams were low, the Ottomacs subsisted on fish and turtles. The former they had killed with surprising dexterity by shooting them with arrows when they appeared at the surface of the water. When the rivers swelled, fishing almost entirely ceased. It was very difficult to procure fish, when often failed the poor missionaries on fast days as well as flesh days, though all the young Indians were under the obligation of fishing for the convent. During the period of these inundations, which lasted 2 or 3 months, the Ottomacs swallowed a prodigious quantity of earth. The travelers found heaps of earth balls in their huts, piled up in pyramids 3 or 4 feet high. These balls were 5 or 6 inches in diameter. The earth which the Ottomacs ate was a very fine and unctuous clay, of a yellowish-gray color. When it was slightly baked at the fire, the hardened crust had a tint inclining to red, owing to the oxide of iron which was mingled in with it. The travelers brought away some of this earth, which they took to the winter provision of the Indians. From the winter provision of the Indians, they reached Angostura on the 13th of June. In 75 days, they had performed a passage of 500 leagues on the five great rivers: Apure, Orinoco, Atabapo, Rio Negro, and Casaquare. And in the vast extent they had found but a very small number of inhabited places. After the life that they had led in the woods, their dress was not very in the best order. Nevertheless, they hastened to present themselves to Don Felipe de Yancarete, the governor of the province of Guayana. He received them in the most cordial manner and lodged them in the house of the most secretary of the Intendencia. Coming from an almost desert country, they were struck with the bustle of the town. Though it contained only 6,000 inhabitants, they admired the conveniences which industry and commerce furnished to civilized man. Humble dwellings appeared to them magnificent, and every person with whom they conversed seemed to be endowed with superior intelligence. Long privations give a value to the smallest enjoyments, and Humboldt could not express the pleasure he felt when he saw for the first time wherein bread on the governor's table. They felt themselves on the first day after the arrival tired and enfeebled, but in perfect health. Bonpland began to examine the small number of plants which he had been able to save from the influence of the damp climate, and Humboldt was occupied in settling by astronomical observations the longitude and latitude of the capital, as well as the dip of the magnetic needle. These labors were soon interrupted. They were both attacked almost on the same day by a disorder, which with Bonpland took the character of a debilitating fever. At this period, the air was in a state of the greatest celebrity at Angostura, and only mulatto servants they had brought from Cumana felt symptoms of the same disorder. It was suspected that they had imbibed the germs of the typhus in the damp forests of Cassiquare. Their mulatto servants having been there much exposed to the rains than they were, his disorder increased with frightful rapidity. His prostration of strength was excessive, and on the 9th day his death was announced to them. He was, however, only in a state of swooning, which lasted several hours, and was followed by a solitary crisis. Humboldt was attacked at the same time with a violent fit of fever, during which he was ready to take a mixture of honey and bark, a remedy much extolled in the country of their Capuchin missionaries. The intensity of the fever increased, but it left him on the following day. Bonpland remained in a very alarming state, which during several weeks caused them the most serious inquietude. Fortunately, he preserved sufficient self-possession to prescribe for himself. The fever was continual, and as almost always happens within the tropics, it was accompanied by dysentery. Bonpland displayed that courage and mildness of character which never forsook him in the most trying situations. Humboldt was agitated by sad presages, for he remembered that the botanist Loefling, a pupil of Linnaeus, died not far from Angostura, near the banks of the Caroni, a victim of his zeal for the progress of natural history. They had not yet passed a year in the torrid zone, and Humboldt's faithful memory conjured up everything he had read in Europe on the dangers of the atmosphere inhaled in the forests. Instead of going up the Orinoco, they might have sojourned some months in the temperate and salubrious climate of the Sierra Nevada de Mercadia. It was I, he thought, who chose this path of the rivers, and Bonplant's death, if he dies, will be laid at my door.